Tony's Topics. Welcome to Tony's Topics. What do I want to discuss tonight? Let's get into the Mike Brown, Officer Wilson case. I recently saw a tweet by Kobe Bryant and it kind of brought out the issue. So I want to continue with this forum. I already talked about the Trayvon Martin issue, so let's just talk about the facts of the Mike Brown, Officer Wilson case. Okay. So Mike Brown had recently gone into a convenience store, robbed it, basically with his bare hands, because Mike Brown was a pretty large guy. I mean, from the video, he looks like he's somewhere around 6'5", somewhere around about 300 pounds. And basically, he forcibly takes the cigarettes that he has on the video, pushing the store clerk owner out of the way. Now, I've heard some word that might not actually be the video, but from what I've read of the confessions of his friend did admit that, yes, earlier in the day, Mike Brown had just stole some cigarettes from a convenience store. Okay, so Mike Brown is already a criminal with that action in there, right there. All right. Now, Mike Brown and his friend are walking down the street, and an officer tells them to remove themselves from the street. Maybe the officer said it in a nice way, maybe he said it in a mean way, there's no telling. But what is significant is that Mike Brown's friend admits to the fact that they did not remove themselves from the street. So therefore, they are already usurping the officer's authority and basically disrespecting the laws by not getting out of the street. You would think that after just robbing a store, they would be quick to comply with the officer since he wasn't trying to arrest them for robbery, but that they would just get out of the street. Alright, he goes. But either way it goes, Mike Brown and his friend decide to continue to walk in the street. This upsets the officer, and I guess the officer does some move with his car that almost hits Mike Brown and his friend. And then the officer opens his door, which he says, Mike Brown's friend says, that hit Mike Brown. This starts the altercation, and a fight commences with the officer in his car and Mike Brown on the outside of his car. Keep in mind, this is all in broad daylight, because when we saw the videos, Mike Brown's body is laying in the street in broad daylight out in, I guess, Stanton, New York, or wherever that is. So either way it goes. Alright, so now a fight has pursued, and according to the witnesses, the two ladies, I saw a witness video about the two ladies who saw what happened, when they looked out of their window or whatever. So Mike Brown is fighting the cop. Now, it's debatable whether or not Mike Brown was trying to punch into the vehicle or the officer was trying to pull Mike Brown in. Let's just dispute the logistics. The bottom line is a fist fight had occurred. Okay. The officer now grabs his weapon while he's in the vehicle and fires a shot at Mike Brown. This has enabled the fight or flight response in Mike Brown, and Mike Brown chooses flight. He tries to get away from the officer. Everyone recognizes that Mike Brown was away from the officer's car. This is just a stated fact. So, at one point, the officer and Mike Brown were close enough to have a physical altercation, but in the next minute, Mike Brown has made distance between himself and the car. So that means he was trying to run away. It's just a fact. Unless the officer's car moved, which it didn't, Mike Brown had to move. It's just physics. Okay, so Mike Brown has been shot at and thus is trying to get away from the officer. The officer comes out of his car and fires at Mike Brown, this time hitting Mike Brown. According to the witnesses, Mike Brown turns around and puts his hands up in a surrender fashion. The officer then proceeds to end Mike Brown's life. Okay, so let's just put fault where fault goes. Number one, Mike Brown shouldn't have robbed a convenience store. Absolutely. He was a criminal for doing that. Number two, Mike Brown should have gotten out of the street. He was disrespecting the officer as well as disrespecting the law by not removing himself from the street. Okay, number three, Mike Brown should not have engaged in an altercation with an officer. Absolutely. He was engaged in a fight with an officer. The end. I don't know who started exactly, who threw what punch first, but you don't start a fight with an officer. If it's for nothing more than to not put yourself in a terrorist situation where you're being held at gunpoint, because make no doubt, he's just a man with a gun, and in that not a terrorist situation, but a hostage situation. And in that particular situation, due to the fact that he has a gun and you don't, you are in a hostage situation. So let him say whatever he needs to say so that you can get yourself out of the situation, and then you can go and file a complaint at his, at the police station with his supervisor or whoever and handle it properly. But sadly enough, some people aren't even getting to their getting to make that complaint to the supervisor or to have their day in court because they're getting taken out on the street. Either way it goes. So an altercation pursued with Mike Brown and the officer. So that is the third fault. But let's just also get to the bottom line facts. Mike Brown is dead. So anything that Mike Brown did wrong, he paid the price for. So now let's look at the officer. Number one, the officer admitted to not even knowing that Mike Brown had stole the cigarettes. That's first of all, so the altercation that pursued was not directly affected by the fact that he thought that this individual stole the cigarettes. Okay, the officer did tell them to remove themselves from the street. They refused. The officer followed it up. Now, should he have risked endangering them by hitting them with his car? That seemed to be a very bad scenario right there. I don't think they probably trained you to do that in the police academy, but at the same time, the officer did have the right to approach Mike Brown due to the fact that he was not respecting the authority that the officer had. We have officers in place as a representation of our government and our authority. If people are not respecting the officers, you are literally disrespecting the government with this move. Okay, so the officer then engages in a fight, and again, I don't know who threw what punch first, but an altercation commenced. And honestly, if we backtrack, I ask, why did the officer get to a point where an altercation was necessary for jaywalking? Honestly, this officer wasn't using great thinking. Granted, the guy jaywalked, but that wasn't a reason to have an altercation ensue. Possibly if the officer was feeling angry, he should have maybe kept a distance, and hitting the man with your car, with the car door, or allowing for a collision to occur, unless it was accidental, that was just kind of, he should have more or less maintained distance, or, but the officer did have the right to to close the distance because Mike Brown was disobeying the authority. So he could have pulled Mike Brown over, and thus it might have been a resisting arrest. Either way it goes. Moving forward. So, an altercation pursues. The officer is under duress, under assault, might feel that he's losing, might be compromised, thus he pulls out his gun and he fires. The officer at this point is in his right to fire. You don't fight a cop. You don't fight an officer. So the officer is well within his rights to fire his weapon at this time in self-defense. However the fight ensued, the officer is within his right to fire his weapon. Now, at the point Mike Brown tries to get away from the officer, that is Mike Brown trying to free himself from the situation. Now, the officer continued to fire. I think at this point, due to the fact that Mike Brown had chosen the flight aspect, the officer had no need to fire at him additionally. Therefore, this shot was unwarranted. Possibly the officer could say that, hey, I felt like my life was at risk, but how did you feel your life was at risk when he's pointed that way trying to run away from you? So that was just a blatant lie by Wilson. There is no way Mike Brown chose the flight method. So for him to say that his life was at risk was a lie because clearly the suspect was trying to get away. So there was no need for the officer to fire his weapon at Mike Brown from that time. He was in pursuit of him. There was really no reason. Why didn't the officer just get back in the car and drive him down with the car? Or, ride him down with the car or call in backup? Why didn't the officer call in backup if an assailant or a suspect was trying to get away? Okay. But he fires at him. Fine. So the officer tries to down the suspect by firing at him. At the moment that Mike Brown puts up his hands in surrender, there was no need for an additional shot. The officer, at no point, once Mike Brown puts up his hands in a submissive way, has no validation whatsoever to continue shooting at Mike Brown. But the officer did continue to shoot at Mike Brown. And this is murder. Officer Wilson committed murder. He lied on the stand trying to say that he thought that Mike Brown had a gun, which any officer can say these days, but time and time again, it seems to end up being someone's cell phone or someone trying to get their keys. Any officer can say, ooh, I thought he had a gun, and use that as validation for self-defense and killing someone over it. But the bottom line is, they're not waiting to even see if it's a gun. The guy put his hand in his pocket. I think he has a gun. Pow! Really? Is that what we've come to? Officer Wilson murdered Mike Brown. Mike Brown had submitted himself. The end. There is no rationale to justify someone who submits themselves to an officer and then the officer blowing them away. That's my time and that's my topics.